Today on Inevitable, we have three guests, and our focus is on the clean energy tax provisions currently at risk in the Congressional budget reconciliation process around what's known as the One Big Beautiful Bill. This is our second episode on this topic this week. Our guests are Jeremy Harrell, CEO at Right of Center clean energy policy solutions firm ClearPath, Spencer Nelson, Director of Federal Affairs at Forum Energy, and Vikrum Iyer, Head of Global Public Policy and External Affairs at Heirloom. My goal in this conversation is to get to the root of the changes afoot in the draft of the legislation that was passed by the House and currently under consideration by the Senate. I'm also hoping to hear what reasonable change proposals are on the table and to hear how those of us working in the innovation community around climate and energy can help influence outcomes. From MCJ, I'm Cody Sims, and this is Inevitable. Climate change is inevitable. It's already here. But so are the solutions shaping our future. Join us every week to learn from experts and entrepreneurs about the transition of energy and industry. Jeremy, Spencer, Vikram, we got a whole party here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Cody.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks.
This is the second episode I've recorded today on this topic. So, clearly I feel it's an important one, and hopefully folks tuning in also believe it's an important one. And I got three of you here, so I believe you all believe it's an important one. Really what I want to do in this conversation is unpack some of the specifics of the various clean energy, manufacturing, industrial policy provisions, energy provisions that are at risk in the current draft of legislation that's making its way through Congress. And so I wanted to start by having each of you guys introduce yourselves, and then we'll start digging into some details. This is going to be a wonky episode, just as a warning for everyone at the front end, but we're going to end it hopefully with some calls to action for folks who decide, hey, this is something I want to try to make some change around. Here are things I can do. Jeremy, maybe let's start with you.
My name's Jeremy Harrell. I'm the CEO of ClearPath and ClearPath Action, a conservative clean energy organization based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to accelerate technological innovation that reduce global energy emissions. We work on everything from scaling up new technologies like advanced nuclear, long-duration energy storage, geothermal, and CDR, to how do we make building blocks of the global economy like cement, steel, and chemicals in a lower carbon, affordable, lower carbon way. I've been at ClearPath for a little over 8 years, but I've been in DC for over 20 or almost 20, working on clean energy policy. Before I came to ClearPath, I worked on Capitol Hill for Republican policymakers, crafting tax, energy, natural resources, and transportation policy.
And Jeremy, one of the reasons I thought it was really important to have you on for this particular topic was to show, not all Republicans hate clean energy, which would be maybe a misconception that some people might have. And also because we are dealing with how do we influence Republican members of Congress, and thus are probably more likely to want to listen to the points of view of somebody who comes from that side of the aisle themselves. And so those are my reasons why you're here. And I'm so grateful you've made the time to join us.
Absolutely. And there are Republicans who want to drive for an affordable, reliable, clean energy economy. And fortunately, over the course of this debate, we've seen some champions really emerge and frankly, bipartisan policy get across the finish line over the last decade. And we've got to leverage that momentum here in this moment and what is a really important tax debate.
Spencer?
My name is Spencer Nelson. I lead federal policy for Forum Energy based in Washington, D.C. We are commercializing a new class of multi-day iron-air batteries for the electric grid. So they're 100 hours in duration. We're manufacturing them in West Virginia, and they're really about taking the reliability of the electric grid to the next level. So I do all of our federal policy, working with stakeholders in the administration and on Capitol Hill. And before this, I also worked with Jeremy at ClearPath for a while, and I also used to work on the Hill on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee.
Vikram?
I unfortunately do not have the privilege of saying that I had that chance to work with Jeremy at ClearPath in the past, but maybe one day a guy can dream. Thanks for having us, Cody. Longtime listener of the pod, first time guest, so excited to be here. I head up public policy for Heirloom, Heirloom is a direct air capture technology that has investments in the Gulf Coast in Northwest Louisiana and a facility up and running in the Central Valley, about an hour from where I am today. And our technology is based off of a relatively simple science. Some PhD research based out of Japan and Colombia, as well as the national labs, sort of facilitated this understanding that limestone is made up of certain component parts. And when we heat that limestone, it loses a molecule of carbon that thus makes that limestone super thirsty and acts like a sponge, wanting to attach itself to as much carbon dioxide in the air as it can possibly glob onto. We then stack that limestone vertically high on trays, kind of looks like a server rack. And we're able, just by exposing that limestone to the ambient air, to pull down tons and tons of CO2. I think the most exciting thing about this conversation today is that oftentimes folks think of direct air capture or carbon management in the context of sequestering that carbon. But what we have found, especially as we've expanded our reach into the Gulf Coast and spent time in Northwest Louisiana, is that there are countless applications for that feedstock of carbon dioxide, and that CO2 can fly for the market where it is today on sequestration. It could also be applied to enhanced oil recovery, stronger crop preservation for farmers who want to manage their crops during extreme weather, to synthetic aviation fuels that the Department of Defense can use to ensure that they have to refuel their flights for jet engines fewer and fewer times. So CO2 as a strategic advantage to America, and deepening our supply chain to make sure that that advantage helps advance our energy security is sort of the business that Heirloom is in, starting to treat carbon dioxide not purely as a liability, but frankly as a commodity for America's energy security in the road ahead. Previously, I had the opportunity to work in the White House, the National Economic Council. I led public policy for a division of Uber, a company called Postmates that became Uber Eats. And then I also worked on Capitol Hill, where I had the chance to work for Ed Markey when he was on the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Spencer and Vikram, thanks to both of you. You have a lot of work you're doing right now to get the word out and talk to various members of Congress about how certain provisions may be impacting your own individual businesses. I appreciate you coming here to share with us just a little bit, more broadly about ways that other founders or other startup team members, or really, frankly, any concerned citizen can get involved here. And I thought it was important to have your two companies in particular to show that the impacts here are broad. Obviously, there's a huge implication on solar and wind and energy generation generally, but there's implications across the broad energy manufacturing and industrial landscape. Spencer, obviously, what you're doing in long duration energy storage has wide-reaching implications for data centers and other things like that. And Vikram, you just outlined multiple ways that Heirloom's captured CO2 can be used for carbon sequestration, but can also be used for various other industrial purposes. So I thought important to share that context and have you both here to do that. Maybe before we dive into all the actions folks can take, though, I'd like to spend some real time getting into the weeds of where are we with this legislation today and what particular provisions are facing what particular changes. So, Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to kind of guide us through the details of the various, I call them the various 45s and 48s, but maybe start with just a kind of a high level overview of where we are in the process and what is going on.
We would start at the very bottom, and folks probably know this as many of the listeners on this podcast are directly impacted by many of the policies that are advancing through the reconciliation process. So this bill, what House Republicans are calling and the president are calling one big beautiful bill, is their reconciliation package. And what that means is legislation, because Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House, that they can move unilaterally without bipartisan support, given that political dynamic. But the important component of it is they are limited into crafting provisions that are oriented around funding and revenue. To oversimplify it, they've got narrow majorities, and so they've got to keep their caucuses together as it advances. It's a tool used to move legislation and has been used previously in different political configurations. It's how the Affordable Care Act got done at the beginning of the Obama administration, for example. It's how the Trump tax cuts got across the finish line in 2017. And it's how the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, got across the finish line in the Biden administration. And so typical partisan process that runs and policies can move without attracting bipartisan support.
And as I understand it, where we are today is the Republican administration broadly has, I would call it a primary goal of extending those 2017 tax cuts, which were landmark legislation from the Trump 1 administration. I believe that the math on those says extending those cuts, not adding a bunch of new, sort of tax cuts to individuals or corporates, but just extending the current ones would cost, north of $3 trillion in terms of deficit spending. And so basically they have to pay for it somehow. And the pay for it's have ended up mostly coming out of a combination of Medicaid cuts and these various clean energy cuts. And without doing that, we're facing an even greater sort of annual budget deficit. Even with doing it, it looks like we're facing a greater annual budget deficit. And so that's sort of the kind of the math that I think people are trying to navigate right now. Is that the broad picture?
Exactly right. In the end, they are trying to extend the individual tax cuts that were enacted in 17 and provide some new incentives that are in place. The president talked a lot about no tax on tips, reducing tax burden on certain types of payments like Social Security payments, along those lines. And so this bill is trying to drive those tax policy forward. And you're exactly right. And the clean energy tax incentives come into play because they're trying to find ways to offset the cost of those tax credits. And that is what the big debate across Congress is.
It's almost a philosophical debate of, do you believe it's better to reduce people's, or not even reduce, not regrow people's individual sort of tax brackets? Or is it better to incentivize and spur manufacturing and energy policy in the US? It feels like those are kind of what's on the table.
Well, what we're finding is Republicans want to do both. They're trying to navigate how to do that. The unfortunate dynamic is because the original tax cuts were done by reconciliation, it means they expire at the end of this calendar year. And so no action means tax increases in a wide variety of ways. And so what we have seen materialize over the course of this debate is some Republican leaders in states where significant investments are being made, where jobs are being created, where there's a national security imperative to grow American manufacturing or grow supply chains, them coming forward and saying they want to protect many of these incentives, expand some of them, and scale back others. And that's where we sit today. So the House took action a few weeks ago that was the first step in this process. They laid out a bill that ultimately they did get to pencil out in some shape or form. There's competing budget projections out there. In some cases, as it relates to the energy and credits, they kept credits in place. Things like the 45Q tax credit for CCUS and carbon dioxide removal were largely untouched, and we can go in a little more detail there. They extended credits like the clean fuel credit, which was the very first low carbon fuel incentive based on an LCA score, into 2031. And then they scaled back a bunch of credits. And unfortunately, at the very end, a couple poison pills were added that complicate how anyone can use these credits. And that's where we sit today, where the Senate is having a conversation about wanting to extend some things that did get cut, potentially scale back some things that they don't agree with, and really get at some of these poison pills that limit the ability to use tax credits to grow American energy, grow American supply chains, and foster economic growth in this country.
The two big poison pills, I think, are one is around transferability and sort of the ability for these tax credits to be traded by various partners, which, in theory creates a lot more liquidity in the marketplace. And then I think the other one is around these essentially foreign entity ownership concerns, which has this funky acronym of FEOC. Do you want to maybe unpack each of those for us a little bit?
Yeah, I would say there are three kind of major concerning things that need to get taken care of. You're exactly right. Number one, this FEOC issue. So in the end, policymakers want to ensure that we are catalyzing investments in the U.S. economy and American supply chains and reduce vulnerabilities related to quote unquote foreign entities of concern. And a big chunk of this is trying to get at Chinese investment. And the language that landed in the House passed bill is frankly unworkable. It would be impossible for many companies to comply with, not because they're China exposed, because they would struggle to prove that they're not China exposed. And so they've got to get at that issue.
And so what this would mean is even if they do continue to qualify for some kind of tax credit, otherwise that doesn't get canceled or rescinded or shortened, if it's still available to them, there's this thing on top of it that says, oh, but you use some widget that the raw material for that widget was made in China. So sorry, you don't qualify for this tax credit.
And some of the provisions put in place are effectively trying to micromanage supply chains and how investors and how you drive private capital these projects, which is a challenge.
How are you recommending that provision be amended?
in the end, the goal is right. We want to drive more investment in the US. We want to diversify our supply chains, but it's got to be something that's predictable, that is effective, but narrow in focus so that companies can prove the dynamics around their investment strategies and their supply chains, and ultimately ensure these credits are still usable and getting at the goal of driving private sector investment into American companies.
And we have a model for this in the financial services industry with CFIUS, right? It's just sort of a thing that everybody who invests financial capital just has to deal with, and they know how to navigate it.
And even recent defense bills have put in provisions to do it to reduce vulnerabilities on key supply chains that have national security implications, and was a key topic during the IRA on electric vehicle manufacturing as well. So this is not a new topic, and both sides have been trying to get at it. The key is we've got to get at it in a practical and effective way.
Spencer and Vikram, anything either of you are working on with respect to the FEOC here, or any particular concerns that you want to highlight?
From an Heirloom perspective, it's not something that we're actively kind of tweaking, but I will say, building off of Jeremy's point of view here, it's the goal here is a worthwhile one to anchor domestic manufacturing. At the same time, though, as the Senate considers tweaks, at least two things need to come to fruition. One, I do think that any limitations on FEOC provisions, FEOC provisions, have a phase in, so it's less burdensome to American businesses, I think will be a really, really important cleanup dynamic. And then also, to the example that you laid out, Cody, that Jeremy acknowledged, to not cede the US to other markets inadvertently because a screw comes from China or a battery comes from China. Again, very strong intent, but we need to be much, much, much more precise with the legislative language, so it's crystal clear and self-executing, because otherwise that uncertainty and the accident to trip up a small company, because much of the world relies on those tiny tier 3 part supplies from that foreign entity, could actually hamper U.S. manufacturing and sweep in a lot of paralysis. So clearer language and phase-in provisions are at least two things to start.
Yeah, I totally agree. Being a lot clearer is important. At the end of the day, these credits are trying to incentivize new manufacturing and production in the US. If you make them too difficult to actually use, then no one's going to take the credits, and then they're not going to follow that purpose. And then we're not going to be building the manufacturing supply that we need to be able to avoid reliance on China. So you really have to thread that needle. And right now, the current text goes too far in one direction. We need to pull it back so that we can continue getting off of Chinese supply chains.
All right, let's tackle the next one that we highlighted, which was transferability. Jeremy, do you want to set the table on that one for us?
Transferability is something that the clean energy communities and the energy community has been fighting for a decade, to make these credits more efficient. It allows more efficient financial partners, drive more private sector investment, and increase the uptake, the incentives towards the goal, which is driving construction and the build out of new technology and manufacturing here in the US. The House bill takes a very piecemeal approach on this. So Republicans and Democrats have been pushing for transferability for years. In fact, President Trump signed a tax bill in 2017 that provided a couple years of limited transferability for a handful of credits, like the 45J tax credit. And then the IRA ultimately extended transferability in many cases across the life of these tax credits to many of the tax incentives. The House bill does this in a very piecemeal approach. It scales back transferability to a couple years for a handful of credits, like the 48E clean electricity credit, for example. It allows utilities to use it across the life of the credit for things like the 45U existing nuclear incentives, so utilities can monetize it as they draw new investments to preserve existing nuclear facilities. And then in a handful of credits, you get it for a couple years. So I mentioned earlier the 45Z clean fuel credit exists to 2031, but it only gets transferability for 2 years. There is way more support for transferability in the Senate. And I think the preferred path forward would be, for as long as these credits are going to stay in place, we should maximize the efficiency on which we can utilize them and try to drive as much private sector investment into the sector as possible. And so we're pushing for the Senate to effectively fix this piecemeal approach from the House and extend transferability across the life of all credits.
You gave the reason why FEOC was created, though maybe agree with the how it was implemented. Why was transferability so dramatically limited? What problem was that trying to solve?
Yeah, there are some ideological differences on being able to transfer credits as a whole. And so folks will say, oh, well, you're transferring credit to a big corporate that doesn't need the tax cut or a big financial institution. What is detached from that argument is, especially for early stage companies and even some later stage companies like investor owned utilities with complicated ways that they can utilize tax equity or with complicated tax appetite, you need flexibility to fully monetize these credits and ultimately drive the investment in space. And so, especially from an organization like ClearPath that's looking at technological innovation and trying to deploy new nascent technologies, in many cases, these companies are pre-revenue, right? And so they have limited tax appetite. So we should have transferability so that we can drive the private sector investment into those technologies.
That's right.
And ultimately catalyze them and make them commercial and show that their commercial viability.
Just to underscore what you just said, if you're a company that isn't yet generating a lot of revenue, you're trying to build your first facility, your first factory, or even your second, but you're still, not generating a ton of revenue from a tax liability perspective, you can't take advantage of a tax credit because you have nothing to offset it against. And so your ability to then sell that tax credit to someone else can bring more revenue to you and can let them deal with applying that tax credit to their existing revenue liability.
That's exactly right. And Cody, if I may, just even reflecting on the numbers, I believe since that point that the provision was enacted in 2022, some estimates say that transferability have unlocked nearly 50 billion in clean energy investments and catalyzed over 100,000 new jobs. So not only is it helping scale emerging industries like tripling U.S. manufacturing capacity here in America, which is ostensibly the goal of the big, beautiful bill, but also I think it's really important to recognize how transferability can help the tax equity markets come, particularly at a point where the new administration has transitioned in with a perspective that these new projects, these pre-revenue early stage projects, ought to pencil for the American people. And one of the best ways that we can do that, and that even the secretaries of energy and interior have telegraphed that needs to happen, is by suggesting that a little bit of angel investing from Uncle Sam and then quickly bring in private capital so that way it can kind of transition off of those government subsidies in perpetuity. The transferability piece allows us to bring in all that additional capital. For every $1 in tax credits, we can bring in an additional $4 in private capital, which means that the projects can start to pencil not just on the own merits of the tech and how it grows, by introducing an additional private stream of cash. So that way you can eventually kind of lean off additional subsidies over time. And I think that's a really, really important dynamic that'll help ensure that the projects are working for the American taxpayer.
Seems like it has a specific benefit to help emerging technologies that themselves are not highly commercial yet.
Absolutely agree. We just opened our first factory in West Virginia at the end of last year. So 2025, this is going to be the first year that we are delivering batteries to customers. And we are technically still pre-revenue, but we've already had to front load building this factory. And without the ability for transferability, it's just a lot more difficult to make the project.
Hey everyone, I'm Yin, a partner at MCJ, here to take a quick minute to tell you about the MCJ Collective membership. Globally, startups are rewriting industries to be cleaner, more profitable, and more secure. And at MCJ, we recognize that a rapidly changing business landscape requires a workforce that can adapt. MCJ Collective is a vetted member network for tech and industry leaders who are building, working for, or advising on solutions that can address the transition of energy and industry. MCJ Collective connects members with one another, with MCJ's portfolio, and our broader network. We do this through a powerful member hub, timely introductions, curated events, and a unique talent matchmaking system and opportunities to learn from peers and podcast guests. We started in 2019 and have grown to thousands of members globally. If you want to learn more, head over to mcj.vc and click the membership tab at the top. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Actually, Spencer, I didn't know your first factory was in West Virginia. So we've got you here building a factory in West Virginia, and we've got Vikrum here building a facility in Louisiana. So two red states that are building large-scale facilities, relying on a lot of these provisions.
That's right.
And no coincidence, some of the loudest senators you've been hearing over the last week have been Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana.
Jeremy, tell me a little bit more. There was a third poison pill that I didn't have in my list that I want to hear from you what it is, because I don't know what it is.
The other major concerning factor was something that happened at the very end of the House process. So it was basically injected in the wee hours of the night before the final passage in the early morning of the subsequent day. And that was putting a 60-day requirement on the tech neutral, the clean electricity credit, on effectively what we think is one of the most important credits that exists in the code today to drive new investment in new energy generation in this country, especially in this moment where rising demand is meriting a significant need for more investment.
This would be like advanced nuclear, geothermal, I would assume hydrogen, maybe things that are net new forms of power that we can use in our country.
Exactly. All new generation. So the pre-IRA, the tax code was a bunch of technology-specific incentives. And ultimately, there was bipartisan momentum for years to try to go to a more tech-neutral approach. And ultimately, the IRA established this new 48E, 45Y clean electricity credit. And it's an incentive put in place, either an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for new generation in the U.S.
So they have to be under construction within 60 days of bill passage in order to qualify?
For a wind and solar and storage in particular, you would have to commence construction within 60 days of enactment. So it effectively means that nothing gets to benefit from it that isn't already in the queue. And frankly, many projects that are in the queue today are going to get undermined. And so that has to get fixed as they look to adjust some of the dates and figure out how we have an incentive in place that helps drive new investment in new generation.
Moving into a few of the other sort of various 45s and 40Es, the big giant boom we've seen in this country in the last couple of years is the rise of commercial solar, right? Like it's just been phenomenal. I think something like close to 90% of new power generated in 2024 onto the grid was renewable power. And I think that 48E or commercial solar investment tax credit is facing a major sort of scale down as part of the new legislation. Any comments on that and what that might do to the commercial solar industry in the US?
Especially in a moment of rising demand. We've had 2 decades of where we've had largely stagnant commercial demand. Providing incentives to drive new investment in new generation, regardless of technology, is going to be really important. I mean, by some estimates that ClearPath has done, we may have to build the size of today's Texas grid over the next decade to meet rising demand from electrification, from AI, from data center growth, and an influx of new manufacturing in this country. And so in the end, ripping out an important tool to drive investment in that new generation today actually works against President Trump's energy dominance agenda as well. I mean, they've been talking a lot about the AI race in particular, and energy supply is a significant limiter there. And so I am encouraged in the Senate. There has been a handful of members talking pretty publicly about this, about wanting to provide a longer glide path. So how do we get at that poison pill that I mentioned, that 60-day commence construct requirement? And then how do you do a reasonable phase down of the credit for wind and solar? Originally, the House had kind of proposed something in the 28 range for the full value of the credit, and then 3 years of a phase down in value. Something the industry, the solar industry and wind industry are actually pretty used to. That's effectively how the credits were phased down in 2015 in a big tax bill that was negotiated in a bipartisan way. And then the House also did put a longer lead time and gave a commence construct timeline on it for new nuclear. And I think you're seeing a lot of members talking about new nascent technologies like nuclear and enhanced geothermal, maybe long duration energy storage, hydropower, even fusion should have something like a 2030, 2031 timeline so we can catalyze investment in this first wave of new projects. And so I think we need predictability. I think we need to ensure that we can still drive investment into new generation here in the US across technologies, because we're going to need to build everything. And then I think it is reasonable to talk about these credits existing in a different time frame for technologies that are commercial today versus technologies that are scaling up and are fairly nascent.
I think that's spot on. Well, I'm coming at it from one specific vantage point on the carbon management side, but like just to set the stage there about what Jeremy's reflecting on when it comes to energy dominance. The global race for carbon management, we see it as actually, frankly, intensifying. It's driven by growing demand for CO2 storage, utilization. China's making aggressive inroads and investments in DAC and CCS to secure their competitive edge. Europe plans to store and use about 50 million tons of CO2 annually by 2030, embedding it into fuels. And frankly, even if we want to invest in hydrocarbons and make America the best LNG exporter again, one of the top export markets for LNG in Louisiana, for example, is Europe. And they have carbon intensity requirements, which require LNG exporters shipping out of the Gulf of America to go straight into Europe to also have that CCS or that DAC offset. Major subsidies coming down the pike in Canada, major incentives in Japan. So the race is heating up. And I think kind of to answer your question, Cody, even though it was about a specific tax credit, what Jeremy said is spot on, because if the United States fails to match this momentum, we really do risk ceding control, a critical industrial input becoming dependent on foreign controlled carbon dioxide based products and feedstocks. And that's just from the DAC perspective. But if we cede that control across a whole host of energy dominant creating technologies, many of which that might be tied or might have to chase these incentives in other markets, it not only reduces the ability for us to build here, it could increase the possibility that some companies feel that they're too early, so they have to take the incentives from FEOC registered countries. And frankly, it could expose U.S. manufacturers to additional penalties, weakening our competitive position in global markets. So I think the problem statement is clear. And one of the ways that we've seen the Senate approach this conversation, including, as Jeremy mentioned, senators like Murkowski, like Senator Curtis, like Senator Moran, Senator Tillis, Senator Cassidy, I think we're really looking forward to this conversation on the Senate side of this discussion, because it allows us to take a step and take a beat and say, okay, the intent is to find and make sure the energy projects pencil, but let's also do so in a way that creates certainty. Let's do so in a way that's surgical, and let's do so in a way that guarantees our energy security, not cedes it.
Is there any world where the attempt to try to find cost balance in the overall package is found because these tax credits, which, yes, do cost something to fund initially, end up actually spurring GDP growth that shrinks the deficit because it actually spurs domestic growth in a true Renaissance way? If I'm trying to think about this from a Republican principles perspective, I feel like that's where I would net out.
Everything is a trade-off. So, one thing that we've also seen in some recent analysis looking at the expiration of these new tax credits could raise electricity prices in a lot of those states where there's a lot of electricity demand increases coming, right? So I've seen, in some states like in Arizona or in California, maybe a 15% increase in electricity prices, which, on an annualized basis is a few $100s. That could be offsetting some of those tax benefits. But there's also a huge renaissance happening in manufacturing of energy technologies. So we're just one company with one factory, but in the announced pipeline, I saw a report this week that was saying it's about 100,000 jobs in announced new factories across the country for technologies that qualify for the 45X advanced manufacturing tax credit. So there are other industries where the U.S. is finally regaining the lead and taking that back from China. And we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently shutting those down before they have the opportunity to become a new part of the American manufacturing base, which is also a goal of the president's as well.
I just recorded an episode. I don't think it will have shipped by the time this one goes live because we're trying to expedite this one, but I just recorded with the Andreessen Horowitz team on their whole American dynamism thesis. And that is the crux of the thesis, which is manufacturing coming back to America, particularly in areas where there is strong national interest that needs to see onshore innovation happening. Spencer, great of you to highlight that if these go away, we actually end up potentially in an inflationary environment on energy where energy costs increase dramatically. That hurts growth. Jeremy, back to my question on, is it possible that the Senate decides, actually, it may cost us a little bit more to do this, but we believe we will grow our way out of that cost? Is that a math that might end up resonating with people?
It's definitely a case that resonates with members who are thinking about economic development. They're thinking about the national security to invest in these supply chains, the effort to win the AI race in this country. Unfortunately, as you think about how a bill pencils out from a pure congressional standpoint, and we're getting really in the weeds here, so sorry, folks, but that is not how the Congressional Budget Office or the Joint Committee on Tax scores things. But is absolutely part of their calculus in their brain as they think, like, if we think about how we use scant federal resources and federal scoring, for the lack of a better way of putting it, we should be providing financial incentives that have the chance to spur exponential economic growth, because that's good for competitiveness and it's ultimately good for the long-term economic impact of this bill. Because in the end, the judgment on this bill is going to come over the next decade as we see how it impacts economic dynamics and drives investment into the economy and grows jobs.
I think what's germane to that point too about how members are thinking about it is this may have come up in your prior pods, but this morning, just a few hours ago, at least 13 House Republicans, where the bill had already moved out of, are urging Senate leaders to substantially and strategically edit the bill to have that kind of focus of like, let's use the scalpel approach. Those members, if they're pushing the Senate to think about the very fixes that Jeremy laid out on FEOC, on transferability, and other matters, I think that suggests that even within the House GOP caucus, even in Mike Johnson's caucus, there's an interest to improve clean energy production for America.
Yes, I wish that would have happened 30 days ago, but here we are. I'm glad they're speaking up now, I guess. Okay, so going back, the three poison pills, the FEOC, the transferability, and the 60-day sort of commencement window to qualify for various credits, all things that you believe, broadly speaking, need to be dealt with. Then there's some individual changes on individual level provisions potentially. What should folks do? How can people listening who are motivated to take action do something? If you are a founder of a startup, what should you do? If you are a venture investor, what should you do? If you are just a concerned listener or an employee at a company, what should you do? What have you seen work?
First and foremost, it's engage right now. The window is the next 3 weeks. If I had to put money in Vegas on when this bill is going to get signed into law, it's in the next 6 weeks. It could be before the 4th of July. Action time is now.
And that is because you said that it has to pass because the 2017 tax cuts otherwise run out. And so the Republican motivation is do not let those run out.
It is the debt ceiling is kind of the back end here. So Congress has to increase the debt ceiling by the end of July before they leave for August recess. And I think there is motivation to give as much lead time for hiccups here. So they want to drive forward and get it done before they leave for the 4th of July.
Okay, so the time is now. And what does that mean? What is the thing to do?
Reach out to key Senate Republican targets today. And your listeners, the investors, the early stage companies, I think have a really unique and important voice here. Because in the end, corporates have varying different tax priorities, right? There's a lot of corporate tax related items that are touched on in this bill. There are certainly organizations like ClearPath that are working on the ground and working in this space. There's trade associations in DC that represent industry. But you all are the particularly compelling messengers. You're representing the cool tech startups that are going to transform this country, that are going to grow this economy. And folks want to support that type of work. And the investors in this community are the people who are putting private sector capital and leveraging the limited federal tax appetite and federal tax policy to grow this and put significant investments on the private sector side. So target those members, talk to them about the economic impact, tell them how it is impacting the investment community and how private sector resources will be shifted into this sector over the coming years, and ask for them to take that scalpel approach, fix these issues. And then we're going to invest more in American supply chains. We're going to grow American energy innovation. We're going to reduce emissions and have a significant economic growth.
Vikrum, Spencer, what has worked for you all in terms of engaging specific senators, specific members of Congress? How do you find the right people to target? Who do you try to reach? Are you trying to reach the actual senator? Are you trying to reach a specific staffer? What's that sort of game of finding the right person to dial look like? And what kind of conversations do you end up having with them?
You have to figure out what are the specific issues that your company is going to face because of the potential changes that are in the House bill, and really try to understand what are the direct impacts that would happen to your company, both on maybe on a technology perspective, on a future of your industry, but also on a very specific geographic basis too. So think through, what is the footprint of your company, of the projects you're developing, maybe of your upstream suppliers. You work really closely with another partner in another part of the country, and, there's some kind of big change to the tax credit that would have an impact for you. And literally map that out and think through, where would I have these impacts? Bring the stories to those staffers. So a lot of times, for every office, there's going to be a staffer who's associated with tax or with energy. You can look them up online. It's all publicly accessible, and reach out to the office and say, hey, I want to come in and talk about, my concerns about this policy. And just make it really clear and say, I'm concerned that if this happens, we're going to have this very direct impact that's going to be in your state or with my industry. And this is really what this downside is going to be. It's really important to just be as clear as you can about potential impacts and the challenges you're seeing. And a lot of times, a lot of the folks who are working on the Hill, they're very busy. They've got a lot of different competing priorities. They honestly often are unaware of all of the various industries that they're working with or that have impacts on their state. And so hearing that from different cross sections of the economy and from different parts of the energy or startup ecosystem, it's really helpful to hear all the various different ways that some of these changes to the tax credits can make a difference.
From an Heirloom perspective, there's 4 steps that any company that finds themselves concerned can and should take. The first is, in the spirit of what Spencer laid out, make very clear what these investments in America are economically. What is the job creation promise, and how can these tax credits help? The second thing you should do is that link the tax credits to the offtake of private contracting and the injection of private capital. Again, these investments in clean energy are not there to replace incumbent energy majors. They're there to be additive. And they're also there to bring in and onshore and reshore private capital that can help these companies eventually get off of government reliance. I think both the economic gain and the fact that you're going to draw new capital is going to be really, really important of a 1-2 punch to make the case for why these are investments in energy dominance through an all of the above approach and not a replace and transition approach. The third step is to target specifically members on Senate Finance Committee and the Environmental and Public Works Committee. If you need help getting in touch with those staffers for Senator Murkowski or Barrasso or Cassidy, you can feel free to reach out to us at Heirloom Carbon, Vikrum at heirloomcarbon.com. And the final step I would take, number 4, is think about the partners where you build. These projects pencil in communities. There are local trade associations, local community colleges, local workforce development organizations that also see the downstream impacts of your ability to build and to allow the tax credits to support penciling of that building. Make sure that when you knock on the door of those offices in DC, that you're bringing them with you, because oftentimes those local groups will have a powerful voice in making the case to the members, in addition to augment the perspective of the industry corporate.
And just curious for what you all have seen, for folks who are listening who aren't a founder of a startup or don't run a venture firm and maybe just want to speak with their own voice, what works? Is it calling the DC office of your local senator? Is that a good step? Where does critical mass start to matter as well?
Each office will really pay attention to how many total phone calls they're getting on a given issue. And you'll typically see that a lot of senators and House members will want to know, how many calls am I getting this week on this topic versus on this topic? How many of those are coming from constituents versus from non-constituents? So I think it's always good to touch base with your actual direct elected official, but also, if you can, try to identify who's the individual who's specifically working on energy or tax policy in a given office and find their email and just reach out to them and say, hey, could I give you a call about this specific issue? In addition to just calling the office generally, actually try and just reach out and say, can we hop on the phone with this specific staffer? That's usually going to be one of the most effective things as well.
How does the increased public awareness of just the fact that this is even happening because of the whole Elon Trump thing in the last day or two, how does that impact this? I assume public awareness is good broadly.
Public awareness is good. I think you're seeing more attention to the bill, more attention to some of the policies that are in it. I also think it's going to build momentum for the bill to move more quickly as things drive forward. And so I think it provides an opportunity for folks to engage, to show that they support these incentives. And ClearPath does polling on this work, and it's incredible. Like when you do polling across the general population, 72% of Americans think that it makes sense for federal tax incentives to be used to drive American supply chains and grow American energy. It's a very politically popular policy. And so know that you've kind of got that on the side. And I think members need to hear that very clearly from the folks on the ground directly affected by it.
I really appreciate all 3 of you for jumping in here really last minute to have this conversation. Jeremy organized a thing for our MCJ portfolio last Friday that I joined and just thought, hey, we need to help share this information, that much more broadly. So appreciate you joining, Jeremy, and then Vikram and Spencer jumping on as well to bring a little bit of the startup and entrepreneurs perspective to the conversation. Anything else we should have hit on that we haven't talked about?
If you need help, reach out to us, please. Harrell@clearpath.org. We've got a 40-person team here in Washington. We're happy to help on that front. I know Vikram said the same, and I know Spencer feels the same way, but that's why we exist. We're in this push, and we want to see, investors and companies like your listeners succeed because we think it's the future of energy in this country.
Well, guys, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone listening is motivated to step in and participate in these dialogues because they're incredibly important.
Thank you, Cody. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Inevitable is an MCJ podcast. At MCJ, we back founders driving the transition of energy and industry and solving the inevitable impacts of climate change. If you'd like to learn more about MCJ, visit us at mcj.vc and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at newsletter.mcj.vc. Thanks, and see you next episode.